Hello, good morning. I see lots of friendly faces. So I quickly, as we were getting started, just kind of glanced through our list. So I love to see your smiling faces this morning. And I also know that we have some existing and trained PCIT clinicians here across the state. And so that information that you shared with Lindsay before we talked today about when you've been trained and who you might know, it was really fun to look through that and see the friends and colleagues that you've come in contact with. Sarah and I are really excited to talk a little bit more about this just timely topic of what telehealth PCIT might look like in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing. And truly today will be, we do have prepared content, but today should be a comfortable discussion as well. So we'll welcome you to use that chat function. We'll kind of be following along. If there's questions that come up, we'll make sure that we're able to incorporate them and think about them during our time together. So before today, I did try to just go through some of those initial questions that folks were having. And so the things that seem like were going to be really important for us to think about together is just how to do it, what PCIT looks like remotely. Folks were wanting to know how effective internet PCIT or telehealth PCIT would be. There were quite a few questions about PDI and just how to make the choice of whether that's appropriate for a family, and just questions about that first timeout sequence and, you know, some of the places that you know are a little bit more challenging in the treatment process. And then questions kind of more specifically about the equipment and what that looks like. So we are up for the challenge. So we're going to try to talk about all of those things today. And as you come up with more questions, please just put those in the chat. And then once we're done kind of going over some of the basics, we'll really just have a conversation and a discussion about anything that comes to mind or that you're wondering more about.
And I also just wanted, before we get started, say hi to everybody. It's good to see familiar faces and new faces. And I also just wanted to mention that since this whole crazy transition to telehealth has happened across the country, Ashley and I have both been fortunate, I think, to be able to transition a lot of our own PCIT cases to telehealth. So we've been getting good clinical experience in doing the model via telehealth. And we've also, and I had to transition my entire clinic to telehealth. So in this slide is kind of a combination of materials that we've gathered from folks across the country, PCIT folks, non-PCIT folks, and also just our own experiences. So feel free to ask us questions about any of those things, or we also can send additional resources with for some of the things that might be helpful either to give to families or for you guys to have. I know in my clinic, people like to have all the instructions written down. So we have a lot of that kind of stuff as well that we can share.
Yep. Awesome.
Okay, sorry. So jump right in, Ashley.
That's good. I was going to jump in with the introduction. So we're totally on the same page. So Sarah and I work with a training team. We also work really closely with Dr. Kristen Schaffner and Amy Herschel as part of the Early Childhood Innovation Center. A fun fact about our team is we're actually sprinkled across the United States. So we're really sensitive to policies and what's important to think about at the local and at the state level. So Amy and Kristen are located in Pennsylvania. We all were there at one point, but Sarah now lives in New York, and I live smack dab in the Midwest in Iowa. So we are kind of coming at you from different directions. And like Sarah said, we have kind of organized our material today, and it is a collective effort. So a lot of people in the PCIT community have responded and shared resources, and we're going to organize those and synthesize them and pass them on to you as well. So we talked a bit about your questions that were coming up as folks registered for the webinar, and we're going to cover those things. But our real key objectives are going to be to think about, what PCIT telehealth setups look like and technology, how you are going to, or how you would tailor that clinic experience of PCIT into a telehealth format. And then really just we're happy to share and think with you about some of the unique challenges that might come up as you're trying to carry that fidelity from the clinic to the telehealth space. So here's the burning question that a lot of people are wondering, and that's just the bottom line. Can telehealth PCIT be effective for families and children? And I am so thankful for our colleagues, Jonathan Comer's group and several others now have done, some of the initial studies that look at PCIT through the internet or through telehealth formats. And so, as you've gone through PCIT training, that it is an evidence-based practice that really values collecting data to inform what best practices would be. So I am just, really, really impressed with some of this research as, PCIT is a really robust model when it's delivered in the clinic. And the research surrounding telehealth PCIT really finds that it's comparable in efficacy as what you see in clinic-based settings. So when I say comparable, what I really mean is that when you look at the response of child behavioral challenges from clinic PCIT in comparison to internet PCIT, you do see that in families of both settings that you see significant rates of change. So that same experience of having significant reductions in child behavior challenges carries over to telehealth PCIT. What's usually most interesting as folks dive into this literature a little bit more is that when they classify responders, so thinking of that group of excellent responders, if you've been doing PCIT for a while, you can think of a few of those cases that you've had that really just PCIT was the answer for them, and they saw significant life changes across the board. So those excellent responders in clinic-based cases, that's about 15% of the sample size, but in the iPCIT sample group, that was 45% of the cases. So I think that's something that's extremely interesting and worth thinking a little bit more about. But at the bottom line, like as a PCIT clinician, what we want to, think about, and the questions that often come up are families satisfied when you provide services through the computer? Do we lose that kind of relationship or alliance that we have with families through PCIT? And what about some of those obstacles and challenges and barriers? So in the telehealth PCIT study, they did ask parents just these questions. And so really what they found is that telehealth PCIT was similar in and not significantly different than clinic PCIT for families rated satisfaction and the alliance that they felt that they had with their PCIT clinician. What was a little bit lower for the iPCIT group was just the barriers that families reported to getting to treatment. So I think that's interesting in this context of COVID as well. We know families have lots of obstacles and barriers and stressors now, but even in the months and years to follow. So just thinking about the way that this format may remove some of those specific barriers. And Sarah, I'll let you just kind of monitor the chat function too, in case people have any questions. But
sounds good.
So with that, I think that it gives us a lot of great hope, and the data can kind of speak for itself that there is some validity to considering whether you might use PCIT through telehealth. But we also have to really think about flexibility. So PCIT through telehealth hasn't been nearly as widely used. It always seems to take an event or kind of trends within the service system for these things to unfold on a big scale. And so, now is a time where we have to give ourselves and give families a break. If you're starting telehealth PCIT, or if you've been doing it for a while and feel pretty experienced with PCIT, you're not always going to have perfect sessions. There are challenges that come up, and they can be kind of unexpected. So flexibility is really, really key here. So Sarah and I are going to walk you through the clinical process and just kind of talk about each of the steps of the PCIT process and what it might look like through telehealth. So as you're getting started, even before you would do something like an intake, or if you're have an ongoing family, before you'd have those PCIT sessions, some things just to be mindful of or to consider would be whether you are required to have another type of consent. So in the clinic that I work in, we do have a telehealth consent form that families sign before they use telehealth services. So that's just something for you to kind of explore. And our process is our administrative staff sets that up before they schedule their session with the clinician. But it can also be helpful to have things like a little checklist. So Sarah mentioned she has lots of handouts that they use in their clinic to get people organized and kind of set up, which we'd be glad to share some of those things in our resources after our talk today. But you might have just a quick checklist of what you'd want that family to do before they get ready as they're getting ready for their PCIT sessions. And then, technology is a little bit different. And so families have varying levels of comfort with technology. So you really just want to make sure that you create some space for families to feel comfortable with that. So some clinics or with some particular families, it may be really useful to have kind of a tech setup, quick, brief appointment that you would have either right before your appointment or even a few days or a week before to make sure they feel comfortable with it. So can they access the virtual link that you're giving them? Are they able to access the materials that you'll be using through PCIT? Do they have any kind of tech issues like connection issues or equipment issues that you would want to be able to brainstorm and think about with them? And so, when it comes to tech issues, you really have to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And so it really is important that you think through some of the common tech challenges and that you have a plan B option and maybe even a plan C for how you would resolve those issues as they come up. So here's just kind of a list of common things that will come up. You might have times where your family in any telehealth session doesn't show up to that session, or you can't reach them by your typical route of providing them a link. Or in PCIT, it's more commonly that you'll have something like the parent accidentally shuts down their session or closes their video, or the child might do that. Or they have something where their audio just doesn't seem to work, like you can see them but not hear them. And so it can be really helpful if you work in a team that you can kind of pilot some of those things with the other PCIT clinicians that are in your office, just so that you can work through how you'd solve it for a family. Typically, the plan B for things like families not being able to hear you or not logging into that session, the plan B tends to be, in my experience, a phone call. So it really depends on how you communicate with the family. So it's either going to be phone call or email that you're going to contact and reach out. But phone becomes a good plan B for things like audio during your coaching sessions and so on. So different than clinic-based PCIT, you're probably going to want those contacts for your families at your fingertips across your sessions.
And the other thing I was going to say, which I think we might get to this in a little bit, but the other kind of plan B that I have, and this is partly because my experience, I'm in a lot of Zoom meetings all day, and I get kicked out all the time. And so my plan B with my families is also just like, if I get kicked out, just hang tight and I will be back on. And the same is true for them. So if something happens, just being explicit about, that doesn't mean the session should just end at that point. Just, give technology a second to kind of work itself out. And the same is true for if families are having trouble, sometimes just logging off and logging back on can fix whatever the connection problem was.
Yeah, and that really is where the flexibility just comes into play. So having a good plan and, kind of wearing your flexible hat is essential as you're getting started. So when it comes to technology setups, we're going to talk about the most common setups, but we're happy, and I know a few of you, as you were, actually quite a few of you, when you were completing your form for the webinar, said that you might even be interested in having some one-on-one consultation related to your specific setup. So we could talk more individually if that's helpful. But we're going to just share with you some of the common setups to be thinking about. So it can feel overwhelming to many people to think about adding any more technology to PCIT. But the fact of the matter is you're actually not adding more. It's just that your setup is going to work a little bit differently. So the more would be just like using the telehealth platform, but your actual earbuds and all of that, you're just going to set it up a little differently. So to make sure we're kind of thinking in the same way, you're going to have your computer, which you would use to log into telehealth. Generally, what people are using is some kind of video conferencing or telehealth platform where they're able to send an invitation or a link to families. So one platform that's commonly used is Zoom, either through a business account or through an even more secure, like organized clinical portal. But there are many different telehealth platforms that are out there. And then from your client standpoint, there's typically like 3 options that you might see happen, where they might have a computer or a laptop that they're using. Some are accessing appointments through their smartphones, and others use something like a tablet, like an iPad. So it's really helpful for you to know what they will use, because that's going to help you when it comes to resolving any kind of tech issue. You'll know, you'll have a better idea of where to head with that. But so they'll have what they're using on their end. And then what you'll want to think about are just the options for a headset and for audio for your clients would be most important. So many PCIT trainers would really strongly recommend that you have some kind of Bluetooth earbud setup that the family would be using during their PCIT sessions. And so for those of you doing PCIT, you know the benefits of that out-of-room coaching versus an in-room coaching where the child can hear the clinician. But I will say I'm kind of a more moderate when it comes to that, in the sense that the population that I work with, it's just not realistic for some of those families to have a lot of technology. And so I would say I see about 10 PCIT cases a week right now. And right now it's probably pretty split about whether a family has a headset or not. And it does seem to be working just fine for the families who aren't using it. So there's some flexibility with that I think you just want to think through what would work best for your family.
And so Ashley, when you say that, so the folks that are not using a headset, are they not using any headset, or they're just not using earbud wireless headsets?
So yeah, so it's kind of there's a hybrid. I would say they're doing all three things. So your options are a Bluetooth headset, a wired headset like what I'm wearing right now, or no earbud or kind of setup like that, where the audio is just moving through the computer.
So that in that last case, that just means the child will hear what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
That's the distinction for those of you, if that's not clear.
Yeah. And so the audio moving through the computer works particularly well for parents who feel just kind of overwhelmed by that technology. For kiddos that are younger, that, like in the clinic, they just kind of bounce and do their own thing. And they're really not paying too much attention to that other person that's there. I would say it's really kind of those cases. So if you're going to use a Bluetooth headset with a family, I typically just have them use whatever they have at their home anyways. And so we live in a world of modern parenting where a lot of our parents probably are savvier than we are with technology. And so if they're using their own headset, they will know how they sync it to other things too. So you might have to just help them a little bit less with that. So tablets and smartphones are made to set up with those Bluetooth headsets. So that's just something to think about. If they're using that and if they have trouble with the computer, it may just be a matter of changing the technology that they're syncing it to. And then from an audio standpoint, your two options are they can either log into their audio using their Wi-Fi, or they can dial in to most of those platforms using their telephone. So I'm just trying to give you guidelines, but certainly these are just kind of recommendations. So Wi-Fi does tend to be optimal as long as they have a fast enough connection speed. And the reason for that really is just that if you're using something like dial in, that may actually cost them money to be calling, or minutes to be calling into their appointment. So you could give them both of those options. If you're using a platform like Zoom, it actually does give them both of those options and they can just choose what's best for them. Sometimes when you're using Wi-Fi, particularly when families are having lots of people at home trying to use technology all at once, or if you, have families living in areas where internet speed is not as quick, you might get a lag or some choppiness to the audio. And so then you might default to something like a call-in option. Sarah, anything else that you would think of or any questions that are coming up related to that?
Well, my computer in its true fashion just kicked me out and back on in the middle of you talking. So this is just this is the second time already today that's happened. So I'm not sure if you said this, but the combination of various audio and devices is also another common setup where I'm having families who are both using the computer so that I can see them, but then also calling in on their phone so they can hear me. And so there's different ways you can make sure that setup is also working if you have two devices at the same time. But if you already said that, we can skip over it.
I didn't. And I think that's a really great point. So particularly when they're moving to PDI, I certainly have had families have two setups just so that you're more transportable from one room to the next. But I agree, just they're going to want a plan B for their audio and you will as well. So I too have had to call into a session just because for some reason I was getting that unstable internet bar, that goes across your screen and tells you it's not quite working the way you want it to. So there is definitely flexibility in how you combine the video and audio.
And I would just say the only other thing to keep in mind, and Ashley kind of alluded to this a little bit in terms of thinking about, financial resources, particularly in the context right now where so many people are facing serious economic hardships. I've been really mindful to make sure that people don't feel like they need to go out and buy something different, and that we will make whatever they have work. And I think you generally can make whatever people have work. And so like one of my clients, even she has a really old computer and like isn't totally clear what her headset's going to look like. But we're just going to make it work because people don't have money to be thrown around right now. Not that they always do anyway, but I think particularly right now, families are strapped financially. And so just if you have questions about individual cases where you're really struggling to figure that out, I think, you know, reaching out and problem solving either with other folks in your agency or like the larger PCIT community is a good way to problem solve instead of having families go out and buy stuff.
Yeah. So we're going to just show you a few clips of what the setup looks like just to orient you. But the fact that you joined this meeting, I'm guessing you're somewhat familiar with Zoom. So you just see here, this is Sarah's look as she's setting up an appointment where she goes in to schedule the meeting and she can change the topic and then all of the settings, put in the dates and the time that she would meet. And then as she clicks schedule, it's going to give her the option to invite participants. And usually it gives the option to copy this invitation that you see over here. So you can either manually copy it into an email or you can put in your participant's email address and it will automatically send it. I use it's a clinic-based Zoom. It's the same similar thing, but I think it has a HIPAA compliancy too. So it's all in a portal where I really just push one button, put in my session appointment time, and then the family gets a reminder. And in that format, they can get a reminder either through their email or they can choose to get a reminder through their cell phones, which some families have opted to do.
Yeah, so I don't get that fancy setup since I'm at a university. So I just manually copy my the invitation into emails and then send the family the email directly from me.
Yep. And so as you're logging into that Zoom meeting, you'll get the choice, and you probably got that choice today, to join with audio, or sometimes it depends on what level of Zoom you have, I think, but you'll also have the option for the phone call where it will either call you or you will have to call into a specific number. And then you see at the bottom panel in all of these meetings, you're going to have kind of your controls. So Sarah's defaults are set so that her video is off whenever she logs in. That's how I set mine too, just in case you're transitioning from one appointment to the next. It gives you that minute to be organized and getting ready as you're logging into the technology. But you want to make sure that you push that start the video if you have that as your setting so that they can see your face as you join that meeting. So with that invitation that you have, you're going to see, you should see my white mouse cursor here. You're going to have one option where they can join the Zoom meeting through their computer. And so all they have to do is click that meeting link specifically. Or below that, typically there's that the call-in number that they can use. And so Sarah, this is an example, right, of something that you this is an example of another group and what they might share with their family as kind of a step-by-step tutorial of how to get onto their first telehealth meeting.
Yep. Yeah. So this is there's the group in Miami that has an existing robust IPCIT program. So they have all of these documents already made. And this is kind of an example of what they might send their family to show them a step-by-step kind of tutorial of like what it would look like in terms of getting the email. And then when they log in, I think that top picture where it says call using internet audio, and then the bottom one being once they join and turn their video on, that's what their view would be. So the parent's face is at the bottom and the coach is on the big screen and from the family's perspective.
Yep. And just as a clinician, sometimes you will be sharing materials or showing them a graph or something like that, your handouts or homework sheets. And so on this bottom picture, I just wanted to point out that share button that's there. So if you click that in your meeting, then it pops up a screen that allows you to pick which of your materials you want to share. And then that is what shows up, just like these slides are showing up for you, that's what shows up on the family's screen. So it does make it a little bit more visible for them. And so technology is often the thing that people are thinking about most, I think, as clinicians and getting started with PCIT through telehealth. But, you know, we also really want to think flexibly with parents about the materials and the things that they'll be using during their sessions. So really depending on the population that you work with, some of you may need to think even more creatively than you would in your clinic sessions where you have all your perfect PCIT toys, just what you might be using in those appointments. So if you have a population that is really resource strapped, we just wanted to share with you some creative ideas of things that most families would have around their homes. So you can use anything that falls under that creative, constructive category that also doesn't promote aggressive and kind of destructive play. That's the guideline that you're wanting to think about. So it might be toilet paper rolls, empty cardboard boxes. It could be, you know, cards that they have around the house, or you might use things like clothes or accessories. Blanket forts has certainly been something that has come up in appointments that I've had recently. And so as a clinician, what you want to just think about is, again, being mindful of the family's resources, helping them to brainstorm, having activities that are going to support that parent's use of the PCIT skills and that are going to help the child to display, you know, appropriate behavior as the parents are playing with them.
All right, so so Ashley kind of went through the kind of what you need to get ready. So now we're going to transition to talking about what this is going to look like in terms of actually moving through the pieces of the model. So for your pre-treatment session, where you would be doing, in particular, the sort of DPICS observation, there's three kind of main questions that often come up. And the first is, what if the family doesn't have appropriate toys, right? So Ashley just went through this list of good toy options. So some considerations, let me make sure I can, there we go. For toy choice is, one, you have to talk to them about what they have, right? To make sure that what they're thinking about putting out for the session is going to be appropriate. It also can be helpful to send them the list of toys before the session so that they can, like, you know, can kind of come to that observation session prepared, so that you're not trying to game plan and get the setup correct while you're at the beginning of your session. But if they don't have available things that are going to work for that DPIC session, I mean, the most important thing is just to make sure you're documenting that in your note and making sure that it's clear, you know, whatever they were using and how that might have contributed to some of the behavior that you were seeing. The second question is, how do you keep the kiddo in the room? So one of the ways, and in terms of your thinking about how you're going to help families sort of tackle this, is, in an ideal world, if you know that you have a kiddo who is very busy and moves around a lot, ideally you would have asked that or found that out during your intake interview. And then for the DPICS, you want to help the parent think about a room that either is more closed off, right, in terms of the floor plan, so there's not like a lot of places they could run and leave the room easily, or a room with a door where they could just close the door and maybe position themselves in front of it, or they could put a doorknob covering over so the child can't open the door and get out really easily. So partly just kind of thinking through with families, you know, if for example, they have a really busy kiddo, maybe doing it at the dining room table where there's a lot of activity going on is not the best choice. like in my house, it's a pretty open floor plan, so my kids can just buzz in circles around our downstairs. That probably wouldn't be ideal for an initial observation if you have a kid who's likely to get up and wander around. And then the last question that often comes up is like, so what if the child gets into other stuff in the room, right? Because we don't have control over their environment in the same way that we do in the clinic. So in terms of thinking about, sorry, Ashley. It's like a delay on your computer for me trying to control it. Okay. So it's helpful to think about doing a kind of quick scan of the room at the beginning of the, before the observation, so that you can kind of see. So like what I have tried to do is to have the family kind of show me with their camera what else is in the room, and make sure that there's not anything that really needs to be removed. So things that might, just keep advancing without me. Things that might be dangerous, or the parent really wouldn't want them getting into it. Ashley, will you just take the control back? Because I think there's a delay.
Yeah.
The other main category of things are if there's lots of other toy options available in the room. So for example, when parents are doing this setup in the child's bedroom, and there's other toys available, thinking about, could you get the parent to move those things up out of the way so the child doesn't have access, if that's really the only place they can do the session. So again, if you think back to like, we're trying to be flexible, right? So you're not going to have the perfect controlled environment set up for your observation session. So it's really just trying to maximize the likelihood that you'll get a good outcome, knowing that there's going to be some things you just can't control. So if the bedroom's the only option, that's okay. But then try to see how much you can get the parent to kind of put other things up so the child doesn't have access to whatever they want in the room. Okay, so you go to the next one. So in terms of the CDI piece, once you've moved into the coaching, so you've done the DPICS observation, and so now you're thinking about your teach session. So before the session, just make sure that both you and the parents have toys available for the role play. So that's one of the things where you might think like, well, it's just a didactic session, so it could be easy to sort of skip that part of the protocol. But the role play really is helpful for demonstrating what the skills sound like, but also then having the parent try them out. So we want to still make sure we're keeping with that fidelity, even though we're doing the model in a different platform now. And so making sure they have some toys available to be able to do the role play, and that you have some things available as well. It's also important to think about where the child or children are going to be, and ideally have them occupied in another activity during that session time. So, obviously that's not always possible, but if at all possible, talk with the parent about options so that the child does not have to be in the session room in the same way that you would want to do that in the clinic, right? It's not ideal to have kiddos present for the teach session. We can make it work if we have to, but it certainly is much easier if they're not there. And then for some families, Ashley already kind of mentioned the share screen function. This can be one time that it's really helpful to use it because you can pull up the stuff. For some families who maybe are having a hard time following or concentrating or fully attending because of the telehealth platform, having that visual guide may be helpful for them to follow along. But you can also send it to them ahead of time if you think that would be helpful. Typically, I always wait to give those handouts in the clinic. I always wait to give them until the end of the session so they're not distracting. But I do think in telehealth, there may be other things that are more distracting. So this might actually be a time where giving them something to follow could actually help them be more engaged. And then for the role play, when you're actually going to get to the role play, one of the things that you can do is, so you want to make sure that you're doing things that would be easy for the parent to see, right? And that you're going to want to adjust and position your camera so that they can see you during the role play with the toys. And then just have them kind of practice labeling your play with the pride skills. But with 2-parent families, you can have them play with the toys in the same way that you would in the clinic. Have one parent kind of practice describing or talking about the other parent, and then switch roles, which may be a little easier than having them both describe and label you. So that way they can kind of do it in the room together, and you can just jump in and give them feedback as you need to. Okay. So in terms of keeping with this theme of flexibility, there are some things that come up that you just want to be prepared for and sort of think ahead about how you would kind of try to maximize flexibility for families. And so one is if one of the caregivers who wants to be involved has to supervise the kiddos during the session. Some options to think about is that you could record the session and the second parent could watch it afterwards. The other option would be that the second caregiver could call in with that phone audio only while they're with the kiddos. So they could just mute themselves, but call in and listen to the session. So that way they're still getting the information, even though they're, supervising the kids. And then another situation that might come up is that caregivers are in different locations. So it could be, that one caregiver still is having to go to work, or maybe they're just at a different location because of, quarantine situations or things like that. And so you can have people video conference in from different locations, which is the nice thing about telehealth, right? Is that even when they're apart, they can still come together. Or you could try to find a different time where they would both be available. But I have found that families and parents in particular are struggling. And so my approach has been to try to not let things slow us down in terms of getting started. And so, if it's really seeming like scheduling is going to be super complicated and it just isn't working, I would be inclined to try to move them forward and find another time to get that second caregiver involved rather than delay giving treatment. And then the third situation is that we also now, in this current situation, there may be other caregivers who are providing more care than they typically would. So grandparents who maybe are now living in the home, or other family members. And so if those other folks are much more involved in providing care, but maybe don't really want to do PCIT. So some options would just be to share those handouts with those caregivers. You could also invite them to call in or join, a coaching session just to observe it, as it may be helpful. Or they could go back and watch a recording of the teach session just to kind of promote the skill use that when they're with the kids, even if they're not actually doing PCIT. Ashley, have you had any situations of other caregivers joining in with the families you're seeing?
I have one family who's asked to record their appointment so that the other caregiver could watch it later, and that's worked really well.
Yeah. And then the last thing is that at the end of your teach session, you want to make sure you give the reminder to parents to make sure that they've charged all their equipment and have all the materials ready to go at least an hour before the next session. And that's true every week, right? So the worst is when you're in the middle of the session and the parent's computer dies, or they don't have it charged in and they're not really aware of it, or their Bluetooth device isn't charged. So just giving that reminder to people to make sure all of their equipment is charged and ready to go is really helpful.
Okay, you're getting questions, but I'm gonna make us hold because I know you're gonna get there.
Okay. All right. So thinking about coming into your CDI coaching sessions, priority one is safety, right? So we want to think about removing anything hazardous from the environment that we can. And that includes things like drinks, rolling chairs, outlets being covered, hot water, I'll go through the whole potential list of various things that might be in a home environment that we would not ever have to deal with in the clinic. And you want to make sure that parents are thinking about these things in terms of where their setup is for the coaching session, including like covering sharp corners of the furniture, or maybe you just don't do the session near furniture that has sharp edges if you can avoid it. And the other thing is we already talked a little bit about this, but in terms of the doors, you want to make sure that those doors are secure so kids can't just run in or out during a session. So we have one family that I'm supervising right now where the sibling just comes in the room all of the time. We're going to talk about siblings in a minute. And so initially the target child would leave the room all the time. So we've been really just working to get the parent to sit in front of the door to manage that problem. And it has worked very well to minimize both kids being where they shouldn't be during the session. And then you also want to think about the physical placement of the parent and child relative to the space that they're in. So, you kind of want to optimize. So like in the clinic, we have it very intentionally set up where we have something at the table and then something on the floor. So you have this kind of natural option to transition to a different toy if you need to. You want to think about those same things with your families in their homes. And part of that's going to be just contingent on the space that they're in. So if the only option is at the dining room table, there may not be an option for them to move to the floor for whatever reason. So just thinking about, what your other options are, how you'll manage that ahead of time, and making sure that you are kind of aware of what other things might be in that space that could be dangerous. The second consideration for coaching sessions is minimizing distractions. So again, we are in uncontrolled environments. So there's other people in the home, other people are doing different things. To the extent possible, you want to game plan so that your family can identify a space that is away from other people, and that those other people, in particular siblings, have something else that they can do during the session that's not going to be distracting. So like I wouldn't recommend having, the younger sibling go watch the older sibling's favorite movie during the PCIT session, because that's going to be really distracting. And the child is going to try to go watch that movie with them. You also might consider having the family keep the pets out of the room, like if that's going to be really distracting. And also reminding parents that this is a time where they are supposed to be giving the child their full attention. So this is not the time to be getting all the other household tasks done that might pull your parents' attention either, like folding laundry or getting dinner ready, and that sounds kind of ridiculous, but I think it's important to keep in mind, and I don't know how many of you have done just in-home services in general, but when you're coming into families' homes, it's just they're in a very different mindset than if they're coming to the clinic where that's dedicated time they've set aside to go do this thing. It's really more like their life is going on and all of a sudden you're there with them. And so sometimes just giving those reminders that this is a session and you have to make sure that you're carving out this time the same way that you would for the clinic can be helpful. And then the last thing is making sure the kiddo uses the bathroom before the session, the same as you would in the clinic, so that it's not disruptive. And then the last piece of setting up your session is the room setup. We already talked a bit about removing the toys that are inappropriate, and just always come back to that idea that you're trying to really maximize the opportunity for pride skills and minimize the opportunity for don't skills. And as long as you're sort of thinking about it in that way, you're going to know, okay, that toy is not working, and maybe you learn that for the next week where they had a toy that they thought was going to work really well, and it ended up leading to lots of commands and criticism. So you'll just know to the next week not to have that toy out. You want to make sure that during the check-in your video is on, so you would have that face-to-face conversation with the parent, and the child can hear that conversation the same as they would in the clinic. And then when you go into your coding, you're going to turn your video and your audio off and just code the family for the 5 minutes. And then you'll turn your audio back on and coach them with your camera off. So why this works so well is because from a child's perspective, this feels exactly like it does in the clinic, where all of a sudden the coach is gone and they're playing with their mom or dad. And the computer is just going to have a black screen on it, and there's not going to be any sound coming out of it from the child's perspective. So they're not going to hear or see you. And so it really does to them just feel like they're just playing with their parent. The thing to be mindful of is that because kids are, in a different environment and move around, and that your camera is on this little device, unlike in the clinic where you're there and you can move around and see them, sometimes you need to make sure that the parent may have to move the camera a little bit or reposition it so that you can see the toys better or see the child better. And if that does happen, you just want to make sure that you give that feedback quickly and succinctly, so that, you know, it's not just because it's harder through telehealth to, you know, with the lags and communication can be a little bit trickier. So just getting that out there quickly and having the parent move the camera as they need to can be helpful. Another lesson that I have learned in telehealth is that, you know, kids are highly variable in their interest in touching and messing with the computer or the device. And in general, you want to think about ahead of time, assume that it's a problem and make sure the child does not have access to the device to the extent that's possible. Because I had one little girl get onto the computer and ended up like deleting some of her dad's files and these just other complete nonsense. And he just was having a hard time managing the behavior. So they, the next week, figured out a different setup where they could get it lifted up and out of her reach. But that's just something to be mindful of on the front end. So Ashley, should I pause now are there questions that would be relevant to this, or are we going to get to some of them?
There's one that I think we could probably just address. So Josie was asking whether we found that we need a separate telehealth intake, just given all this information that there is to give to families. And truly, some people will do like a 10 to 15 minute brief tech setup and look at like scanning the area and help problem solving that. I think that has been guided a lot by what your organization and what you're able to bill for, you know, with how you decide to format that. So I will say in my practice, what we do is that our admin gets the consent forms for telehealth. And then as they go to their first telehealth appointment, I take that 10 minutes on the front end and do some of that problem solving and get them feeling comfortable before we jump into our information. So I haven't had a specific session just dedicated to an intake related to telehealth. I will say you get better at this. You only have to do a few before you'll have a sense of exactly what matters and what details don't matter as much. So you'll get better with that. And I do think that having a checklist saves a lot of that time. So a visual that parents can say, is the room, am I in a room where I have control of a door, or, you know, where the child is going to, it's going to be less likely for that child to want to go from room to room. All of those details that are just important for them to be thinking about. Do I have creative, constructive items ready for them? So just giving your parent kind of a step-by-step of what to do before they log into their telehealth appointment. Once you go over it once with them, I really don't have families that have trouble over time. It's pretty incredible. It makes you realize just how much people are already using technology in their lives in other ways.
Yeah, and I think for our clinic, you know, our transition to telehealth, it was like existing families. So we did do 15-minute check-ins, but that's all it took was a 15-minute check-in where they would take the camera, walk around the house, show us the setup. They already kind of got like what toys would be good and not good because they've been doing PCIT. But for our new families, we will fold all of that into the initial intake appointment where, like Ashley's saying, it'll just be a rundown of like, okay, so it sounds like you're appropriate for PCIT. Here's kind of the next step. Let's, you know, give me a quick tour of where you think the space will be for your next session. Here's the toys I want you to have available. Show me where that setup is going to be. And it really shouldn't take a whole lot longer than that, I don't think. So I think, again, it does come back to like billing requirements and, you know, after you've done it a couple times, I think it will be apparent that it really is more seamless than you might expect.
And Laura had a question about whether we had a checklist that we could share, and we'll share a handful of resources just based on our conversation and what you all are needing. We'll share that after our call today.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're coming in still. Let me just see. The next question is, has the length of the session changed via telehealth? Which is interesting. Sarah and I were just talking with someone else about this morning, like how telehealth has affected our PCIT appointments. And our colleague, Kristen, I think she said something so great at the start of all of this. And it was that PCIT is kind of the natural social distancing format, because you are doing that, that coaching in a coaching booth for a portion of your session. So I haven't found that my PCIT sessions really change in length. I will say that I always in PDI am still doing that quick walkthrough to see where the timeout chair is, to look at their backup space before the appointment. So that's just something that is added to our check-in process in the appointment. But I keep and bill the same amount of time as what I have been doing in the clinic.
Yeah, same here. Our sessions have been identical in length to what they were in the clinic. Oh.
It has a mind of its own. It's only funny, right, that you have we're talking about telehealth, and our telehealth our slides are just going a little wild. Okay.
All right, here we go. Okay, so the check-in. So it is really important, it is tempting now that we're in telehealth, and there's a lot, it feels like there's a lot more to manage. And I think to some extent there is when you're first getting started, but there's just things that might be easy to skip or overlook that I would really encourage you all to make sure that you just start doing from the beginning, the same as you would if you were in the clinic. And that includes going over the ECB and homework. So there are different options for getting your families to complete the ECB. But we really do, as much as possible, still need the ECB to track treatment progress. So it always amazes me how much information it really gives you about what you need to focus on in treatment, especially when you're thinking about labeling the positive opposites, or when you get to PDI, what behaviors are still really lingering. And it just gives you access to things that parents don't always think to tell you. So it's an incredibly useful and important treatment tool that you still need to use. And the good news is that there are electronic ECBs available through the PAR website, which we'll show you on the next page. And you also could mail hard copies of the ECBs if you wanted. That seems a bit less ideal in terms of just the logistics, but it's an option. Or you could send, so if you can pull hard copies of an ECB and copy it to send it, you could, but just remember that it's copyrighted. So like you wouldn't, you would need to kind of like use the one that you're copying as counted as used, essentially.
You need to keep purchasing them.
Yes, yeah. Right. And the last option would just be to have the parent answer the ECB verbally, and then you could fill it out on your end. And if none of those options feel feasible, then what some folks are doing is using a briefer measure, which is the WACB. And the WACB is like 7 items, Ashley, or maybe 10? It's a significantly reduced number of items. And it gives you sort of like a flavor, but it doesn't give you as much specificity in terms of like specific behaviors that you might want to target in treatment. So it's better than nothing for sure. But if you can do the ECB, that's really what we would recommend.
And the WACB there's actually 2 different forms. One's focused on positive behaviors, the other's focused on negative behaviors. So typically people will give the WACB-P during CDI, and you could change to the N version during PDI. But the bottom line with that measure is it's quicker, but it's not standardized. So you really would only be able to compare their answers over time. It kind of weakens like what information you're going to be able to pull for interpretation. I will also say, I think with the ECB, it's so important to keep it up regularly, but you have to think through what's going to be feasible for your parents and just know what stressors they have in their life. And so there's a continuum for everything. And I think in the PCIT community, people kind of vary in whether you have to do that in absolutely every appointment or not. And so, just generally, my recommendation would be think about that family and think about their progress and what that data is doing for you. So you want to do it regularly, but you may not do it in every appointment.
Right. And that's a good point, because I think I have, I can think of some families I have who, as we've gotten farther into PDI and it's basically bottomed out, I may not continue to give it every week, but would certainly get it, at the very least, maybe every other week or every 3 weeks, depending on how many sessions are left. And for sure, you want that post-treatment ECB as your last one.
So in my clinical practice, what I've found is the best thing is if you can possibly get that family to fill it out before the appointment, just because if you think about what it's like to verbally have to give it, and I certainly have done that because I'm like, we really need to know what you're thinking about this. And, you're just not getting it completed. You're going to have to find a way. But if you can get that to your family, either through the electronic ECB through the PAR website, which is the same website your organization has used to buy hard copy ECBs if you've purchased them, or by sending like a PDF or something electronically in advance, that really is the best case. If you send a PDF, I'll just give you a little trick that some parents and others may not know too. But if you have like Adobe Acrobat, there's the option to fill and sign. Like if you all have done that with professional paperwork before where you need a signature. And then if you fill and sign and you do it for yourself, you're able to just put check marks or X's on different things and then save that PDF that way. So that's a way that a parent could fill that PDF out for you and send it back to you before your appointment. That works pretty well.
Yes. Okay. So then reviewing homework. So obviously, you still want to make sure you're reviewing homework. If the sheet wasn't completed, you can always like share your screen in that same way we've talked about and complete it with the family at that point. I would just treat it the same way that you do in session. If the family hasn't completed the homework, you're just going to go through and ask about it in the same way that you would in the clinic. And in your very first session, the same way again that you would in the clinic, you want to explain to the kiddo kind of the purpose of the session and how it's going to work. So your parent's going to have this little earbud in, and they're going to hear me talking. You might hear me from time to time. You're just going to focus on playing and having fun. And so the same thing happens at home as it does in the clinic, if not more so, which is the kid kind of forgets about you and just goes about their business playing. So it really feels very similar to the clinic coaching. All right, Ashley, will you go to the next one? So this is just the website that has the kind of cost for the various administrations. And we can make sure we give this to you, but we wanted to have it in the slides so you also can see it in terms of where you buy the ECB and kind of how it works.
And there's a link there to the left side, which is an activated link when we send you our slides that you can click right on that. And that's typically what you would need. Mm-hmm.
So some considerations for CDI coaching is that there is a lag on the audio sometimes. And so you want to, because of that, you want to think proactively about how you're going to make sure that your coaching is still as effective as it would be in person. So the way I have tried to approach this and think about it is, number one, prioritizing feedback. So you don't need to give feedback on every single skill in the same way that you might in the clinic. You want to just pick out the kind of try to group things together as best you can. So instead of going through each of the don't skills, you might pick out the one that you think is most important and give feedback on that. You also want to make sure that your feedback is brief. So if you're telling the parent or coaching the parent to do something different or doing, or to like, just giving them feedback in the moment about the child's behavior, it's really important via telehealth to keep those statements brief. Even more so than in the clinic, because there is this weird lag that can happen, or it can be choppy and the parent might not hear you as well. So you might just need to be a little more directive than you typically would be in the clinic. And then the last is really thinking about anticipating what's coming next in the session in terms of the behavior. So it may be that your coaching might focus a bit more on helping the parent anticipate things. So when he comes back to the table, what could you praise him for? Versus giving that moment-to-moment feedback. And it's not a whole lot different than how it would feel, but it's a little bit more kind of forward-thinking. the nice thing is you have way more opportunities to target real life behaviors and in particular praise positive opposites that actually matter in the home environment. So I have found that you can start targeting these things way earlier in telehealth than you might do in the clinic, because they're just presenting in front of you all of the time. So you might think about things like if the child is leaving the room, or if they have been, don't really engage with the parent. So you're going to incorporate these positive opposites for all of these different problematic behaviors pretty much right away in CDI. And part of that is because it's going to help your sessions stay on track better. And it's also going to help you get tighter control over the environment, which is more important in this context because, there's a lot that we don't have control over. So if you can get the parent praising and building up these positive opposites right away, your sessions are going to go better. In terms of some of the other skills and how they're a little bit different in telehealth, it's a little bit harder to hear the kiddos because of the audio setup. So one really good strategy is just to assume that if the parent says something and you didn't quite hear what the child said, but the parent says it as a statement, just assume it's a reflection and coach it that way. So, that's maybe giving them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, but at the end of the day, that's better than missing an opportunity to increase reflections. And with behavior descriptions, it actually works really, really well via telehealth to increase these because we legitimately sometimes cannot see what the kiddo's doing. So you can just say to the parent, oh, just describe what he's doing because I can't really see what he's playing with. Or, it looks like he's getting something out of that box, right? And then the parent will jump in and start describing it. So to some extent, you can really use this to your advantage to increase skills in a different way that feels more legitimate or like honest, than it would in the session where you could really see what they were doing and you're being strategic about it. But I think with telehealth, you actually cannot see what's happening. So it feels a little more real. And then the last thing, with the imitation and engagement is just to make sure that there is enough toys and options available so that, because kids are going to be playing with, their favorite toys oftentimes, and you don't want it to be, create a context where they're feeling a little possessive or like they don't want to share. So you want to make sure there's enough options so that parents can do things that are not going to be triggering to the child and that will still provide opportunities for that imitation and engagement. So we created a little video clip of what coaching in action will look like, but Ashley, I think that's not here. I'm gonna just share my screen really quickly because I think that's not the right clip. And this is just to give you guys a sense of like, okay, so you've gone through all of this, but like, what does it actually look like? And so I'll show you what it would look and feel like to coach. All right, can you all see this screen? Okay. And give me a thumbs up once it starts if you hear the audio. Turn my mute on for a minute and just watch you guys play, and then I'll give you a little bit of feedback. So you can just let him know it's special time, and then you can just jump right into using those pride skills.
Okay. All right, Leo, it's special time.
In this entire thing, there's like fighting.
There's fighting?
On this thingy.
What thing?
In the Batman party.
This is a Batman party? Cool.
The ice cream.
Yeah. See your ice cream.
That's how you know.
That'll get you some more pieces.
Oh, Joker. I would say.
You're building a bat cave, right?
No, this is the Batman party.
Oh, I thought it was a party at the bat cave.
Dude.
But it's a Batman party. Cool.
Yeah. Metal. We're doing different things.
Okay.
All right, so you did a really nice job
Batman
with those reflections and a good job kind of following his lead. So what I'm going to work on increasing is describing what he's doing, and then also using those labeled phrases where you tell him what you like about how he's
I
playing.
don't know where
So you could start out just by talking about what he's doing right now.
Okay. All right, you're getting those pieces to finish your bat cave party.
Good behavior description.
I swap them for
Swapping those out.
Nice reflection.
7 for
What'd you say?
you do not know where I want it.
No, I did not know where you wanted that.
Nice reflection. And if you don't hear him, you can always just tell him you don't hear him instead of asking that question.
Okay.
This is where this was gonna go.
He's
You're
doing
getting
a
the tower piece now,
good job describing.
and you're building this really tall.
Great describing. And he's also being super careful.
And
Good job being
take
gentle.
off.
You're being very careful and gentle with these Legos, too.
Mhm.
And those ice cream cones look delicious right there.
Dad, those are balloons.
Oh, they're balloons.
Good
Those are
reflection.
balloons.
Yeah, but they can't.
I like how he
fly.
always corrects
Now-
you when you get it wrong too.
Now you're looking for some new Lego pieces to add to your tower.
Good behavior description.
Some animal.
Here come the animals.
Dad, this is a zoo. But
This is a zoo, a bat zoo?
yes,
And another nice
That is so
reflection.
creative, Leo.
I love that.
I love how imaginative you're
I
being.
know room for
Bat
the
Nice
other.
praise. Good praise. And that's okay. If he goes away, you can just start describing what you're doing at the table. And when he comes
Okay.
back, just praise him
Where
for
are
putting
the
it
green
over.
platforms?
All right, and do I add to his tower?
You can if you want, or you can just start
Okay.
talking about what you
Build
see.
my own thing? Yeah. All right. I'm going to put these pieces on here to
And then he came back over.
make a little cage for one of the zoos. Thank you for coming back to the table, Leo.
Nice,
Yeah,
good
I was
praise.
reading
Great
that.
reflection.
And I have this vehicle.
Yeah, because
Nice job following his lead.
that was
And-
favorite.
It looks like the party's starting.
It's hard to keep up with all of his planning.
After we
You're doing a
go
nice
back.
job sticking with
The
it.
bat zoo party. Here we go.
Good reflection.
No, it's after the battle.
After the
It's
battle.
after the battle.
Good
And the
reflection.
way.
All right. Okay, so that little one has quite a lot to say. And so hopefully what you saw with this, and Ashley, do you want to share your slides again?
Yep.
Is that it does not feel that different than what it would be like in the clinic. And so I'm curious what your all reactions are to seeing the actual coaching setup part of it.
I think we lost Sarah.
Oh no.
Oh.
Am I here?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry, something funky's happening on my computer. So did people have any questions or reactions to the, oh, where's my computer? There we are, sorry. Yeah, we can, I was just gonna ask if people had thoughts or reactions to how that coaching felt, or if it was different than what you thought it might look like via telehealth.
So Laura had one comment that it was helpful, but you can also unmute and just talk if that's easier than using the chat.
And we could also come back to it if you sort of think about things, right? So the child leaving the room, and then just the same way that you might do it in the session when the child does something that's maybe not ideal. And you could see though in this session that the dad kind of turns like he's gonna either go get him or talk to him still. And so just staying ahead of that stuff can be really important.
Those wired headphones probably helped him stay put for a second and get into that redirection. But the other thing you notice in the video is the dad like looks at the computer screen, you know, a couple times. Sarah's screen's blacked out, but that's really common, like for them to kind of be looking towards you for that. So I think that's pretty accurate of kind of what it feels like in a session. And you all have the ability, if you tried to unmute and you couldn't unmute yourself, you have the ability now to do that.
Yeah, so and Laura commented too that it's more normal, like a normal clinic session than you would have thought. And that has been my experience, absolutely, that it really does just feel like you're doing PCIT. You know, it doesn't really feel that different than what it would with some of those minor glitches. Like you can see in the video where there's a lag in the audio and that kind of stuff happens, obviously more than it would if you were in person. But overall, it feels very, very similar. Okay, so do you want to go to the next slide, Ashley? So for your checkout, then you're going to turn your camera back on so that the parent can see you. They can change the audio so that the child can also hear you during the checkout, the same as you would in the clinic. And then it's important to praise the child for anything you thought they did well, you know, in particular, things that you want to see more of in the telehealth space. So, you know, staying at the table or paying attention when you're talking to them, those kinds of things. But really the kiddo can just continue to play or sometimes like the parents will kind of let them leave the room and they're kind of done with the session. That's all fine. And then you just want to continue to help the parent, you know, use and start generalizing those pride skills as much as possible in that checkout time that you have. And then the last thing is that you'll show them the summary sheets using that share screen function if you can, or if that doesn't work, you can always hold a copy of it up to the camera to show them so that they can kind of see how their skills are coming along.
A lesson I've learned is if they are using a smartphone, you're going to probably have to zoom even further because their screen is much littler. So just being aware of what kind of technology they're using and just how close you have to get for them to read your hard copies.
Okay, and so one of the big questions that often comes up, and I'm sure is on some of your minds, is how do you manage some of that more dangerous and destructive behavior when you're coaching folks in their own homes? And so these are some suggested guidelines that have been adapted from Cheryl McNeil and Nancy Wallace for in-clinic strategies for these behaviors. So if the child does something dangerous like climbing, running out of the room, doing any kind of self-injurious behavior, throwing furniture, you know, things that are much more dangerous, the first thing is that prevention is obviously always going to be your best friend, right? So this is why we are recommending that you scan the environment and get anything out of there that you think would be a trigger for dangerous behavior ahead of time. If you need to, have the parent take out all of the chairs or things like that that are movable, that then just minimizes the likelihood of there being a problem. And then if there is a dangerous behavior that happens, you want to coach the parent to physically move the child. If, you know, so like I had a kiddo who started climbing on the windowsill, they need to just go get the child off the windowsill and just emphasize that they're going to not give any verbal attention while doing that, but keep it really neutral and then build in those praising the positive opposites as well. And, you know, trying to redirect the child. So having the parent try to sort of block the behavior, like you might have them stand in front of that window or situate themselves in front of the window, but then keep really playing with the toys enthusiastically. And then, like I said, using the labeled praise for the opposite as soon as possible whenever you see it. You can go to the next one, Ashley. And then the other really kind of COVID specific challenge that has been coming up in telehealth PCIT is siblings. So I've sort of mentioned a few times, right, some of the situations I've had with siblings, but these are going to be additionally challenged in a way that they really haven't been in the clinic. So in some sense, though, I would encourage you to think about this as like, you know, making lemonade, you know, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. So when you have all these extra kids running around, this is a glimmer of or glimpse of what the parent is managing day to day. And so this is an opportunity for you to really help parents generalize the skills more quickly and more effectively. And so in an ideal world, if you have two caregivers, the other caregiver could sort of take turns with the sibling who's not in session. But if that isn't happening or isn't an option, you know, having the parent get the other kiddo set up to do something else during the session, considering scheduling the session while the other sibling is napping, if that's an option. But if that's all not possible, and the sibling is just going to be there or be there at times, you want to maybe try to have the parent sort of sit in between the kiddos so that they can, mediate any conflict that happens, provide visual attention to both kiddos, use the pride skills evenly across the kiddos. So in short, you might just end up doing a sibling session way earlier in treatment than you would otherwise, because that's just the reality that families are living in. And again, that's okay if you have to do it that way. You just want to try to continue to maximize building the parent's skills and working on that, individual relationship as much as possible. So for families I've had where the sibling is going to be there, there's really no other option for the parent. I've still made sure that the parent's doing individual one-on-one time for homework with each kid. And then if we can get even a few minutes of coding or something during the session with just one kiddo, kind of taking as much of that as you can have, but then just knowing that you might have to be more flexible with the other sibling being present.
And we had a question about single parents and just if they, what you would do. And I think really all of these things Sarah's talked about is what you would consider in those cases. Yeah. And I would say one thing that I coach more often in the cases where a sibling had to be involved is just helping that parent know the ratio of skills that one child might need versus the other. So I don't have to do that very much at all, but I might say, Johnny seems like he needs about 2 pride skills for every one that you give Leo, or so on, just so that they can kind of be aware of what's going to keep that dynamic going as they're playing. And that's been really helpful. Mm-hmm.
And then on the next slide, Ashley, so then the other thing is that you want to, but one before that, the other thing that you want to think about is targeting more pro-social behaviors between the kids than, that would really be helpful for the parents. So like speaking nicely to each other, keeping their hands to themselves, taking turns, all of those behaviors that siblings sometimes struggle with, and is a really good opportunity for parents to be explicitly increasing some of that pro-social peer interaction behavior in a way that we just often don't normally get to this early in treatment. So in some ways it can be a really helpful thing to be able to target some of this stuff early on. And then there's some specific challenges for folks in the current pandemic context, because we might have parents who are separated from their kids but still want to be involved. And so it may be healthcare workers who are isolating in a different place, or frontline responders. And so the ways that we would encourage you guys to think about some of these situations is maybe having the parent Zoom or video conference for special time when they're apart from the child, so they could do special time via Zoom or a video conference. They could bring toys or paper to the location with the parent until they come out of quarantine. The parent might just call and watch the session happening, from where they are. Or maybe they would do a recording and send it to the parent to watch. So there's all different kinds of ways that you can encourage parents to kind of maintain some of that special time and involvement in treatment, even when they're not going to be physically present or able to be present with the kiddo in the home.
All right. And so we're going to shift into talking a little bit more specifically about parent-directed interaction. So when it comes to deciding whether you're going to use telehealth PCIT, I think what you're probably starting to hear from Sarah and I is that there's not just one choice of you need to move forward with that or not as an organization. You also have decisions about what that treatment process is going to look like for your families. So PDI is, as you all know, a much different setup and set of skills that families are focusing and working on than their CDI skills. So, it is possible that you might make that choice that during the context of this pandemic that you would keep families in CDI or practicing those skills over time and really not moving to telehealth for PDI skills. But other families, you'll feel very comfortable that they're ready and that it's something that they need and that they could address in the context of telehealth and during this time. But I wanted to give you just kind of 3 thoughts that you that can help kind of frame your clinical decision making. So at the point that you move to PDI, you have a good sense of what that family's process is to date. So as you're moving towards PDI, you want to start really reflecting on, you know, how consistent is that family? How often are they able to attend their appointments regularly? Are they completing their homework as you would expect? How effective is that parent in the application of the skills? Are they able to use strategic attention effectively? Do you notice that their pride skills are generalizing, or are they telling you that that's happening throughout the day in other ways? Really thinking about whether the caregiver is responsive, either because of the technology or just, you know, individual abilities to use the virtual technology and to be coached in that format. How well is that working to shape skills over time? And then we want to think about what we might consider or what we might anticipate occurring during the course of PDI. So, you know, do we feel that the caregiver is demonstrating good emotion regulation? Do we feel that they're going to be able to do the point in the course of PCIT? Are they able to follow your instructions and recommendations well? And what do we expect from that child's behavior? Is the child's behavior going to be explosive? Are we going to have concerns about safety and so on? And then kind of the third thing that you know, you want to keep in mind in your clinical decision making is just the context that they're living within. So some families are going to have more you know, life stress that's happening. They're going to be at greater risk for things like unemployment or housing or food insecurities and some of these other challenges. As well as if you've been doing telehealth CDI work, you'll have a better sense of just whether others in the home are going to be able to handle the rollout of PDI in the home. So you know what that first PDI session is like in the clinic, you know, it's a roller coaster ride, right? You have to get up before you go down because kids learn by doing. And so if they're going to learn that timeout sequence by doing through telehealth, what will that be like for other people that are in that environment? And would that be feasible? Outside of the family clinical decision making, I think really as an organization, just reflecting on how much telehealth you've done before outside of PCIT, how comfortable you feel, you know, what your technology capabilities are, and how comfortable you feel with your PCIT training at this point to move forward with a telehealth format. So we're going to just go over kind of the nuts and bolts of PDI, similar to the way we thought about it with CDI. So before the PDI Teach, the same kind of ideas go where you might give those handouts before that session to have the family prepared and able to engage. Sometimes people will consider starting with the swoop and go option, which I think is a great recommendation, where you have that chair in the special times the family's using in their home. So if they're doing special time in their bedroom, then you'd have them move that adult-sized timeout chair into the bedroom so that the transition to timeout, if a child needed it, would be wouldn't be as far of a distance. But ultimately, then you would use a backup space as they move forward. There may be additional content that you're going to think about in the teach session. So you're going to want to discuss, you know, where other people in the home will be during their PDI practice and during your appointment sessions. You're going to want to game plan with families about how to, you know, we always call it crowd management, right? Of where everyone's going to be and how you're just going to manage all of those distractions. And you know, if it's not possible for that sibling, and I will say, you know, as a child psychologist, I feel so conflicted to make that recommendation to families that siblings are on technology, but truly, you know, it's like real talk with that parent. I say, what will that sibling be entertained with for 60 minutes? And then that's the secret to what they need to be doing during the PCIT session. But if that's not possible for a sibling or, you know, another adult to be you know, entertaining or kind of managing some of those distractions. You want to think with that parent about how they'll manage the siblings' behavior to stay away from that child when they are in the timeout chair in the timeout room. You also want to just think about that caregiver's ability to stick in for a longer session if you need it during that first timeout. And so, you know, I always go with the approach to, if in that first PDI session for time management, you really want that timeout process to happen as quickly as it can in that appointment as you get going with your command giving, just so that you have enough time that's comfortable for that family to get through the whole sequence. But there are always those unexpected times, and you want that parent to lock in to really following through. So what would their ability be to do that if other family members were working in the home or present? And, you know, maybe just thinking about, should we shift the time of the schedule just like we would in the clinic, just to allow the family more time for accommodations. In the PDI Teach session, you should role play just like you would do that in the Teach session in the clinic. So particularly, you know, you'll want to make sure that that parent has a chair that's present on their end, and you'll want one that you can demonstrate with on your end as well, so that they can kind of work through what the timeout sequence would look like. So in the PDI Teach at home, you can have them think about what chair would they use and what would they like to use as their backup space. What I see in practice is sometimes parents have trouble just like nailing down exactly what they want to use for their backup space. Generally, they know what chair they want to use. So it may be that you know that they have to follow up with you as they think through their backup space just a little bit more, or that you need to start at that next session with making sure that what they're hoping for is a good choice for the backup space. And then you want to have toys available too, so that you can role play and show just what the PDI sequence would look like. And you'll do that through your computer screen. So with PDI, you know, technology becomes even more important that you get it right. So there are some things that you might think about more specifically in PDI. You want to make sure that your camera view is, you know, able to be directed to the child as much as possible, particularly as the child goes to the timeout chair. You want to make sure that you have a view of the child sitting in that chair, or if they need to go to that backup space, it can be really helpful to have a second device that's already positioned and logged into your telehealth from that child's room. So that's an optional piece, but it can be extremely helpful for you to have a view of what that would look like. Also through telehealth, I commonly recommend for families that have baby monitors to put that baby monitor in their child's room, particularly if they have like a video monitor, so that the parent can have their eyes on it and be looking at that as you're coaching them through the appointment. And that works really pretty well. If you have two caregivers, you might have that second caregiver, if they're using something like a computer, just carry that computer as the child moves to the timeout chair, or to be kind of in charge of shifting the device so that that caregiver who's going through the timeout sequence isn't having to manage all of that. But often I'll find that parents will shift to like using their smartphone for the PDI coaching portion, just because those are more easily transported. You want to think about kind of the protection of their technology, you know, and thinking of protective cases or anything that they might need to do to secure that and make it safe out of the children's reach. And I thought I would just give you the a quick tip. If the family's using a smartphone, there are ways that you can actually lock an iPad or an iPhone now, so that kiddos aren't able to control the screen. So I've tried it with my older phone, so I think I have like an iPhone 8. I think I know that as far back as that, it will do it. But you go into guided access mode. So here we've included a hyperlink. I won't go into all of what this looks like, but it'll give you kind of a step-by-step guide of exactly how this works. So this is something that I bet you guys can't see that, I'm sorry. But it's something that has been very helpful for families where a challenge is that kiddos are touching the technology. And we'll share that with you. So, I think an important thing to think about with PDI is families are already doing this. You are just now getting a window into what it looks like in their home. Otherwise, they have been doing this on their own as they've seen you in PCIT in the clinic. And so this is just going to be an experience where your eyes are a little closer on what their process looks like. So many of the same considerations come into place. You want to think about the timeout chair that they're using. So again, in all PCIT, we'd recommend a sturdy adult-sized chair. So you want to look for things like swivels or wheels or comfy chairs. Sometimes parents will try to use things like a timeout square, or they'll have been doing timeout on a step. And I just, I would encourage you to think about this as a slippery slope. So the point of teaching that timeout chair really is to help teach that child how to regulate their emotions in a secure and safe place. And so when we steer from that, it really does become kind of a slippery slope. So you might get that more as you're working with your parents through telehealth PCIT, and this is not a place really to be flexible. Stick to the adult-sized chair.
And the other thing I would just mention about that is that one of the reasons, in addition to the sort of what Ashley mentioned, is that it becomes really hard to tell when a child is quote unquote off the chair if it's not a typical chair. So when parents want to use things like the little bench at the end of the bed, or like a little bean bag, or things like that, where they may have been using those as kind of calm down spaces, off the chair becomes much harder to determine, because those, and even on the step, right, off the chair, off the step is a little bit trickier to manage than how we would think about being off the chair and what that looks like. So it also will just make it easier for you and for the child to learn, and then the parent to implement with fidelity.
Right. And I will say that with the telehealth format, your depth is a little bit off when you even see that placement of the chair. So it's hard to tell exactly if it's 5 feet or 4 feet or 3 feet. So having that caregiver sit on the chair and move their hands kind of around to really see if there's anything that would be a hazard in that space can be really helpful. And ultimately, the parent has some responsibility there related to safety and just making sure that their home is really secure. But as they're working with you as a professional, it's a hand-in-hand kind of process now that you're invited into their home, that you're going to help them kind of solve that. So I often will say things like, think back to when they were babies, when they just started walking and you crawled around your floor and looked for all the hazards. That is what you want to do now. So think about any possible worst case scenario that could happen in that space, and then have the parent do that and have them do it regularly with the timeout spaces that they're using in their homes. So, we go with the mantra that the best offense is a good defense. And so in PDI, you want to make sure that the timeout chair is really safe. And the other consideration that you have to think about is that backup space that they choose as well. And so in the same thread as what we would talk about in the clinic, you want to make sure that it's a safe and a boring space that's really safe of any hazards. So here you see just kind of a list of common things that you would want to be thinking about as you're scanning that space with parents. Like, what is the ability for them to turn over furniture? Are windows and outlets and other breakable objects, are they secure in that space? And what truly is removable? So the most common strategy that I will use is have them use a laundry basket or a box or a Rubbermaid tub, have them put those things, those valuables or those hazards in it, and just get them to commit to that being out of that room for a month and it can be reintroduced as the backup space becomes less explosive over time, that this really will be a shorter term commitment, but that safety and that effectiveness of neutralizing it are key to shaping safe sitting in the chair behavior. So just a couple other kind of additional questions that you might be thinking about. It's like the what would you do? So what would happen if the child threw the chair or they tipped it in that space? What way does their door swing? So if if the backup space is opening, the door opens towards the caregiver, then if the child is trying to escape that space, they're likely going to just place their foot right there at the bottom of that door to secure it and make sure fingers aren't smashed. Or if the door opens into the room that the child is in, then they're likely going to have to hold that doorknob securely. And so just thinking through it at that level, kind of in the weeds for families, is going to really help them. I think the thing about telehealth is when you're in their home and you are at that level of kind of someone with expertise, they really are going to rely on you. If there's a technology issue or an implementation issue, they're going to look for you, look for your advice, and they will, they'll want it. You can use that second device in the backup space. So just thinking about whether that's a feasible option in the family space. And then, if you're using something like Bluetooth technology, you want to make sure that you work with the caregiver to pilot that and make sure the Bluetooth will still reach in the space that you're going to use for the backup space. So a lot of questions, and I'm seeing that we're having some chat questions, but I want to just keep moving forward with some of this discussion to give us time for our conversation. In the PDI Coach 1 session, it really is about preparation and making that decision that the family is ready for that coaching practice. So the PDI Coach 1 session, there will be a couple things that you would do additionally. So you want to make sure you go back through both the backup space and the timeout chair to make sure that nothing has changed since your last appointment, because homes often do from week to week. And then you're going to introduce, PDI to the child in that session. So you'll make the choice about whether the parent should provide that, education about it, or that that you'll do that over the computer. And I will say, just generally, probability, most kids listen to other adults better than their parents when it comes to PCIT kiddos. And so what I will, I'll introduce it to a child if I think that timeout's going to be hard over telehealth, just so that I secure that they heard it from another adult. And then I'll have the parent just kind of re-summarize what I've said or something like that, so they get to hear it twice. And so in PDI coaching, you're going to want to really think about kind of transition statements so that they know, what's going to happen next. So in clinic-based PCIT, there's it's very easy when you're in person to kind of know what the steps are of the session. But as you're going through PDI, you'll just want to help that parent and child transition and know what steps are coming next. You want to make sure that in your coaching that you focus on what is most important and that you really prioritize. So as in clinic-based PCIT, PDI coaching is more direct, but particularly when that person is not seeing you, but they're hearing your voice, you want to make sure that you're supportive, but very direct in your coaching so that it's very clear for that person who's just listening to you to know what steps come next. So focus on concise coaching during the middle of the sequence, and then after the sequence completed, if there's something that you need to elaborate on, that's a better time for that caregiver to hear some of that information too, so that they can synthesize it all. And then, you know, just in your PDI coaching, you're going to really want to make sure that you have that visual of the child for as much of that sequence as possible. It's going to improve your coaching. It's going to help you look out for things that the caregiver needs to be anticipating. So spend some time to figure out what needs to happen with the technology setup, and match your technology to the child's speed. So if it's one of those kiddos who does bounce from place to place, and you know, you imagine an active PDI sequence, I typically move to something like a smartphone for that parent to have right there on their body, or 2 technology options. I just invite them twice, you know, so that they can log in with different technology, so they have options across the house.
And so we have had a couple people who mentioned that they are needing to hop off in the next few minutes to see clients. And so we have a few slides at the end of this that kind of go through considerations for like graduation and public behavior and those kinds of things. But I'm also wondering if it might be helpful to pause now and just see what specific questions you all have, because we will send these slides so that all of the information is in here for you. And if people don't have specific questions, we can just, you know, we can kind of plug along. But I wanted to make sure that if there are questions about things in particular that we've talked about so far that are popping up, that we take a little bit of time to kind of talk about what you all are wondering. Does anyone have anything particular at this point, or should we just keep chugging away? Okay, so maybe we can just keep going through the slides then, Ashley.
Okay, all right. And so I'll try to be concise in case there are a few questions at the end, but the basic principles are gonna apply. So thinking about when that child is in the timeout chair or the timeout backup space, you know, the bottom line that we're thinking about as a PDI coach is supporting that parent, letting them know what step is coming ahead, checking in on them emotionally, you know, making sure that they're feeling comfortable with the sequence, reading them, helping them think about the big picture. But checking in during kind of the timeout in the timeout room is vitally important, particularly with telehealth. You might have to ask, how are you doing in the process? Because you might not get to pick up on everything that you would if you were right there in person. And
I think the other thing that I've experienced with this is like asking parents to let me know if the kiddo, what the kiddo is doing, since you can't always see them. So just being really clear with them ahead of time that, like, you know, this is going to be a team effort, that you need that, like, you're going to be relying on them as your eyes for different components of the PDI timeout sequence, because, you know, you're going to need their help in making some of the determination about, like, is the child off the chair, or is that, you know, how much off the chair are they, what are they doing in the timeout room? So those kinds of things are come up more in telehealth than they do in the clinic.
Yeah, and PDI through telehealth can move more quickly into real life commands because you're kind of right there in the moment, and families are spending much more time together than they might typically be, you know, if our world was opened up right now. So there's lots of opportunities to observe things like brushing teeth, getting ready for bed, or, you know, putting on socks and shoes, things like homework. And it's going to be kind of the burdens that families are having now. So as you think about moving up that staircase of, you know, play commands to more real life commands, you're going to have some good opportunities for just practicing that in the natural environment. With homework assignments, you just want to consider whether it makes sense to give that family homework practice. So folks have played around with different options. I mean, you know, some families, just like in clinic PCIT, you'll make that choice that they're not ready for that home practice until they get a couple more sessions in, and you'll make that same type of choice here with telehealth PCIT. But you might decide, you know, that you're anticipating the family's going to have a transition or kind of a high stress period in the course of their PDI that really where they're not going to be able to commit to that practice. And so you'll want to have a specific plan for how you would handle that and whether they would be doing homework or not. You might use things like role play with caregivers a little bit more, where if you have two caregivers in your session, that could be part of their homework, is that they kind of practice the sequence with one another. And so it really is, again, about kind of that caregiver and family support to make sure that you're meeting their needs. So some people have asked kind of about, well, when you get all the way to real life commands and you start to think about things like public outings, what does that possibly look like, you know, in the world that we're living in right now? And I will say I personally have found that public outings work really great through telehealth, because you can coach that parent in through the public behavior session virtually through their smartphone, or if, you know, just reference your guidelines for social distancing, and you might meet that parent if you're at that place and kind of the opening up. But I think what's really important to think about in the COVID context is that public doesn't necessarily mean social. And so, you know, think of it more like we are starting to really push this out into wherever that family is, wherever they spend time and wherever they go. So you might do a public outing, which is really just taking a walk, or you might do a public outing, which is helping the parent get the trash to the curb, or picking up the mail, or a public outing on a family bike ride, you know, like a section of that. And so or a car ride, where you want to think about what is going to be most helpful in generalizing this to the bigger outcomes and experiences and stressors that family's having. So where are they struggling with behavior outside of the family's, you know, outside of the inside of the family's home? But for some families, you might instead do kind of a second option, which is to use that time to brainstorm with them about particular strategies that they might use across a variety of settings. So you may not coach them through a public outing, but you may do kind of a brainstorm of management. And it can be really helpful to have the parent kind of record what their future plans would be in those situations. So, well, what would they label praise if they were in the grocery store? What would be important preventative praises? Or what might their expectations for the child be? What would be specific instructions that they would give during that outing? So that as they get to that place, they have a good sense of how they'll roll out those public outings.
The other thing that's sort of unique right now that you can pull into this public outing discussion is expectations for social distancing, because I think, you know, kids are pretty variable in their understanding of what that means and what is expected of them when they're out in public. And so helping parents talk about in the same way that they would any other expectation for a public outing, like the use of masks, the use of, you know, what happens if somebody walks by with a dog? Is it okay for you to run over and touch it? You know, things like that. Depending on what part of the country you live in, some of these things may be more or less relevant, but at least where I am, you know, people are still, I mean, they're just at the point where they're starting to go out and about again. And so having that discussion with your kids be done in a way that is relying on these effective PDI skills can be really helpful.
Absolutely. And so we talked about kind of the clinical decision of even deciding that you'll do telehealth PCIT, and then certainly at the point of PDI is another choice of whether you move forward with the intervention. But kind of the third place where we really have to reflect and consider for families is at the graduation point. So does it make, you know, does it make sense to graduate that family during a pandemic? And, you know, here we've given you just some guide points to help guide that clinical decision-making process. So think about what family stressors are in flux and what you would expect as we ride out this pandemic. think about, the loss of jobs or the availability or unavailability of different caregivers. So really kind of consider what that family's, as much as you can, what might be predictable or where some of the risks would be for that particular family in the work that they've been dedicating to PCIT. So just kind of that consistency and predictability of their family structure. And so, parents right now are working a lot to manage their own worries and stressors. And so just thinking about how that feeds in to their PCIT process and whether they'll be able to maintain the gains that they've made with you without having that contact with you. So there really aren't clear guidelines, of whether you decide to graduate families or you let them hang in there right now. And so that's kind of where your individualized clinical decision making comes into play. So it's a little bit of a balance of the parents and the family's ability to manage and maintain the behaviors through the course of some of the stressors that that will be existing, and the kind of clinical need to help them graduate through PCIT. So we know that PCIT, part of what makes it so effective is that we collect data and we're able to see family changes, and that we prepare them to kind of launch from us. So they really do build an independence over the course of the treatment model. And so keeping them in treatment, there's kind of two risks. One is that they become more reliable on us and have more trouble with long-term independence. And the second is that there are other families that are also really needing services at this time. And so, letting someone hang in that's not making change and is really maintaining very well and not taking on another family who has need, that's kind of the balance, I think, that we're juggling in our decision making. So there's no perfect answer. Really the recommendation would be just think about what your supervision structure is and your consultation structure so that you can be thinking about this together. So in the green box, you just see some of the considerations that might help you make some of these clinical decisions. But I know that we really are right at the hour. And so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I think the big picture is that through interventions like PCIT, they can have a huge impact on our communities in this time, particularly for things such as decreasing the risk for abuse, which we know is higher during this time. And as PCIT therapists, you're helping to nurture and grow really consistent routines and expectations in families to kind of mediate some of the challenges and barriers that they're experiencing right now. But at the same time, it's a time for you to really consider your readiness to roll out PCIT through telehealth. And so I would just say, certainly Sarah and I are connecting and talking to many colleagues across the U.S. about this work. We're happy, to answer any questions that you guys are having as you're making those choices for your own organization and for the families that you're serving. Okay. So we're at the hour. So if you if you need to jump off, if you have other responsibilities, please feel free to head out. But Sarah and I will stay just for a few more minutes if there's any questions that you want to make sure that you are able to ask today. So I'll just open it up, and please feel free, unmute yourself and just let us know what questions are coming up for each of you. And Sarah, have you followed? Okay, I'm just kind of looking through the chat.
Most of the chats have been people having to hop off the call and for clients and whatnot, and just saying hello or goodbye.
All right, awesome.
Yeah. But it was really great seeing familiar faces. This is a time where it's hard to stay connected. So we are here, we're in this with you guys. So please, use consultation and supervision to your benefit. And Ashley and I are always happy to help where we can.
And know that you're going to get a nice little treat from us in your email boxes or through Lindsay, just with some, a handful of resources that we found to be really helpful. But we're happy to answer any individual questions that come up. We'll make sure we share our contacts as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Take
Ashley
care.
and Sarah.
All right. Bye-bye.